Everyone, welcome back to another lecture. Today we are taking a look at pessimism in the philosophy of Arthur Schopenhauer. Now, Schopenhauer himself was a 19th century German philosopher, really born at the end of the, hold on just a moment here, I'll pull this up, here we go. So he was really born at the end of the 18th century, active really first half of the 19th century. So his really big work came out in 1819, The World's Will and Representation. He has several other books as well, so he had a second volume to it. Between the two volumes of that work, it's several hundred pages, plus some other collections of essays and so on. Now, during his own lifetime, Schopenhauer wasn't all that influential, but really near the end of his life, his influence started to pick up, and it was really in the second half of the 19th century into the early 20th century that he really became influential on some other philosophers, artists, historians to some degree. So a couple of interesting things about Schopenhauer. He was really one of the first Europeans to disseminate Eastern philosophy and religion, so Buddhist and Vedantic thinkers influenced his thought, which he sort of absorbed and put in there. We'll hear a little bit about that today. I want to talk a little bit about how Schopenhauer's view is similar yet different from the Buddhist view that we were hearing from Gowns yesterday. So that's one fact about Schopenhauer. Another sort of interesting bit, which you're certainly going to get out of the reading, is that he's really a committed pessimist. Part of what we're going to see in the reading today is that just like in the Buddhism reading and in Russell, and we've heard this in some other places, Schopenhauer draws attention to the suffering that life involves, but not only does he think life necessarily involves at least some suffering, he thinks that life is really primarily suffering. And whereas a lot of other people, a lot of the other readings we have, ultimately want to say that we can be happy or overcome suffering, or that suffering can be part of a particularly good life and so on. Schopenhauer's view is basically that we're doomed to suffer, and that really the best you can hope for is that it's not too bad. Not only does he think really we're doomed to suffer, and that existence is primarily about suffering, but that humans are the greatest sufferers on earth, that we're actually in a worse situation than other animals are because of our features and characteristics. So we'll hear a bit more about that. And then finally, he argues that the appropriate response to our condition is really to deny the will to live. So in some sense, just to give up on life. And so we'll hear a bit about that. One other thing I want to say is that in our edition of the text, this fourth edition we have, the Schopenhauer reading has actually been trimmed down compared to the third edition of our course reader. So there was an older third edition that I've used in the past, and it has a few extra pages of reading where Schopenhauer says some stuff that's not in our current edition. So I want to talk a bit about that. I've got a couple of slides that have extra content that aren't contained in the reading. So if you want to make use of that in the responses or in the forums or something, feel free to use those slides if you want. And I could also probably get you a version of that additional text if you really wanted to look into it. But I'm going to be telling you a little bit of stuff that isn't in our version of the reading. I've got a couple of slides, and right up on the title, it should help make clear what's new and extra content. Okay, so coming to this first point, Schopenhauer opens the piece with, I think, sort of this lovely opening. So I always love reading Schopenhauer, which isn't to say I agree with everything he says, at least not necessarily. But he's just so, dour and often angry and upset. And I don't know, I find something very pleasing about that, which maybe that itself somehow speaks against what Schopenhauer's saying. I'm not so sure. And one other thing I want to say here is I'm not going to say much by way of trying to refute Schopenhauer here. I'll leave that up to you to decide if he's right or wrong. We're going to be taking a look at a reading next week by Paul Edwards, where he is explicitly going to attack Schopenhauer, as well as at least one other person we've seen, for really being too pessimistic and really overemphasizing the bad parts of life. So, well, I'll just sort of leave that there for now, and we'll come back to whether or not Schopenhauer is really wrong next week. So for now, let's just see an exposition of what Schopenhauer has to tell us. So he opens with this. He says, unless suffering is the direct and immediate object of life, our existence must entirely fail of its aim. It is absurd to look upon the enormous amount of pain that abounds everywhere in the world and originates in needs and necessities inseparable from life itself as serving no purpose at all and the result of mere chance. Each separate misfortune as it comes seems no doubt to be the rule, or to be something exceptional, but misfortune in general is the rule. So 2 points to note here. One, as Schopenhauer closes there, and as I've stuck up here, he really thinks that pain, suffering, misfortune, bad, right? Bad things, evil perhaps, is the norm. That's the general rule. That's the default situation we find ourselves in. It's not that things are primarily good and, unfortunately there are these pockets of suffering and unhappiness that we have, but rather instead, if you just look at the evidence, if you look at your own experience, and you look around the world in general, really it's misery that comes first, and there are little tiny moments of happiness and pleasure and so on. So that's the first thing. Schopenhauer thinks, unlike many other thinkers, though not necessarily to say all, but he thinks really the bulk of our experience, the bulk of our lived experience is bad. Secondly, unlike Russell, Schopenhauer thinks that with all this pain and suffering everywhere, really principle of sufficient reason, if we think back to Bayer, why is it like that? Well, what Schopenhauer is saying in this first paragraph here, there's got to be some kind of purpose or reason. There has to be some kind of explanation for why things are the way they are. Now, it is a little bit interesting here. If we think about, say, Bayer's talking about the principle of sufficient reason, right? And we think about, say, Russell endorses that scientific worldview. Why do we have the sort of pain and suffering we do? One answer that could be given, that say Russell or perhaps Bayer could give, or that we can give on their behalf or just separately, you say, well, look, pain and suffering are part of human life. The reason for that is because we're the biological sorts of organisms we are, right? Our bodies age and ultimately deteriorate. We experience pain when we interact with our environment in certain sorts of ways. We can also talk about psychology, and there are some interesting questions about whether or not we can fully explain our mental life through physical terms like the function of our brain and so on. But we could also point to psychological explanations for the way our minds work and the way we fixate on certain things and think about certain things. So we could give these sorts of causal explanations. Right? So, and here again, think back there, we give these causal explanations for why we suffer the way we do. But Schopenhauer, here in this passage, is indicating that he doesn't think that's quite right. Schopenhauer is looking for a teleological explanation, right? For him, it's a why question. It's not a how question, right? It's not sort of what mechanisms make us suffer, physical or psychological mechanisms, but rather it's why do we suffer? What's the goal? Whose intention was this? So he is, in some sense, endorsing a similar kind of demand for explanation that we could find in potentially other theistic thinkers, right? He looks at the world around him and says, okay, I see all this pain and suffering. I see things operating a certain kind of way. And why is that, right? Well, it must be that there's some kind of purpose or goal or some kind of decision almost needs to have been made. Right? We have to explain this in human terms or quasi-human terms. It's not merely pointing to causes. Okay. Now, Schopenhauer argues against people such as Leibniz, 17th, 18th century German philosopher, is much more optimistic. Now, Leibniz famously held that good is real and evil is just an absence of good. Much like we can think about light and darkness, we can conceive of darkness just as the absence of light. In fact, if you look up definitions of darkness, that's often really what they are. And even scientifically, when we think about it, what is light? Well, it's something we can measure, right? There are light waves, and we can measure frequencies and so on. Darkness is really just when you don't have any light there, right? When you just have no light, that's when you get darkness. So darkness, in some sense, isn't something real. It's really a kind of lack. And so Leibniz drew attention to this. Leibniz himself was a theist and really provided rational arguments for God's existence and arguments for all sorts of things that typically involved God somehow. And so Leibniz was really trying to come up with this picture of the world that sees an all good, all powerful God as really being the primary reason why things are the way they are. And so for Leibniz, really, God is the centerpiece, and we can explain many things and why they are the way they are through God, and ultimately all explanations have to terminate in God, God's attitudes and desires and so on. Now, Schopenhauer takes this and just flips it right around. He says, look, it's not evil, it's not pain, that's just a lack of something, right? It's not that good is real and evil is just the absence of good. It's not that pleasure is real or happiness is real and pain and suffering are just the absence of those things. Rather, it's the opposite of that. As we've got here, good is negative in its character, evil is just what is positive. Schopenhauer points to our own experiences. Schopenhauer really holds that good is just the absence of evil, right? As he says, it is the good which is negative. In other words, happiness and satisfaction always imply some desire fulfilled, some state of pain brought to an end. He thinks this explains the fact that we generally find pleasure to be not nearly so pleasant as we expected, and pain very much more painful. Now, of course, he says we find solace in people who suffer more than we do, right? We take pleasure or at least a kind of cold comfort in knowing that other people are worse off than we are. But, he says, doesn't that really speak poorly of us all? That we all have pain and suffering, that our experience of that really outweighs our experience of happiness and pleasure. Both, I'm willing to say now, there's a question about whether or not he's fully clear on this here, but I'm willing to say that this is his view. Both in terms of frequency, we experience suffering, pain, unhappiness more, right? So just in terms of overall amount of time, if you think about the course of your day or course of a typical week, Schopenhauer would say you're unhappy and suffering and in some kind of pain, or you've got some sort of desire that's not fulfilled and you're striving for something, you need something, you're unhappy to some degree, far more often than you're happy or satisfied, fulfilled, pleased. Right? We can use a lot of cognate terms here. So in terms of frequency, we're more often unhappy than happy, and in terms of intensity as well. Our experience of evil, unhappiness, suffering is much more intense than our experience of pleasure and happiness. So as you can already see, we're off to a very cheerful start. It's only going to get better. So if you're not already in a sort of okay mood and willing to hear sort of more things along these lines, maybe just pause the video now and come back later. Or maybe it's a good time to just suffer your way through it and then hopefully just kind of cleanse your palate with something else that cheers you back up. Of course, Schopenhauer himself would probably frown on this to some degree, but too bad for him. Okay, so suffering, evil, pain, these things are real. These really constitute our lot in life, Schopenhauer thinks. And this, just what I was saying there, this really constitutes our lot in life. Schopenhauer draws attention to this. As we move through life, as time moves along, we constantly have new troubles and worries that crop up on us, new things to do, new things that need to be taken care of. As he puts it in one place, he says, certain it is that work, worry, labor, and trouble form the lot of almost all men their whole life long. Now, Schopenhauer thinks even if we weren't sort of constantly being bombarded by new things to worry about and do, and look, you can just think about, think about your own experience in life. Just speaking for myself, most days, right, the vast majority of days, weekends included, there's just this sort of constant stream of things to do. I've got to pay this bill, I've got to do this thing, I've got to schedule this, I've got to get that done. There are always these things to do, right? There are at least times, moments, hours even, of leisure, seeming enjoyment and pleasure. But Schopenhauer says, so just as a matter of fact, most of us, most of the time, and throughout our lives as a whole, are just constantly sort of bombarded by these troubles, these things that make us suffer and unhappy and somehow cause us pain. Even if that weren't the case, right? He says, okay, let's just imagine it counterfactually. Imagine your life was easy and you didn't have all these troubles, you didn't have to worry about these things. And you can think about this in a couple of different ways, right? You can think about the world's just sort of the way it is, but say you were born, I don't know, a billionaire or something. You were sort of totally pampered through your life. You never really had to work or anything. You had lots of disposable income that you didn't really have to work for. So you could just do sort of whatever you wanted, right? Imagine that. Would you be happy then? Or alternatively, we can imagine a totally different kind of situation where the whole world is a much better place, or say we're all just in heaven or something. What then, right? Would we be better off if we didn't have all these troubles and things to do and worries? Schopenhauer says no. In fact, he says, and this another quote from Schopenhauer, if the world were a paradise of luxury and ease, a land flowing with milk and honey, men would either die of boredom or hang themselves. If we just got everything we wanted all the time, he thinks we would just ultimately get bored, right? We'd have nothing to struggle for, nothing to work towards, and we would cease to enjoy that state of being very quickly. In fact, we couldn't tolerate it, right? We would just be too bored. So one other thing I just want to stop and point out there, interesting potential comparison with Williams. When Williams is talking about immortality and ultimately we would get bored, right, if we stay the same over time, Schopenhauer is saying something similar here, although for Schopenhauer it's not necessarily a question of immortality that will lead to boredom. It's really not having trials, tribulations, difficult things to try to overcome. There might be interesting similarities and differences between Schopenhauer and Williams there. I'm going to stop talking to leave room for you to think about that yourself and to engage with that if you want in the forums and in your responses. But I think there's something interesting there to be said between Schopenhauer and Williams. Now, Schopenhauer points to children as this sort of interesting case. And now I want to elaborate just a little bit on what he says there, just connecting it to the contemporary experience of children. Of course, at least some children, perhaps many children. But children seem blissfully unaware of the suffering in store for them. This is Schopenhauer's view, right? As we get old, he says, things become more and more clear to us that, in fact, so he puts it this way, is another nice Schopenhauer quote, "You may look upon life as an unprofitable episode, disturbing the blessed calm of non-existence. And in any case, even though things may have gone with you tolerably well, the longer you live, the more clearly you will feel that, on the whole, life is a disappointment, nay, a cheat." So he talks about children being, like the audience at a play or something before the curtain's been revealed and they're all excited for what's about to go on. But then once they actually experience the play, right, they go through life, as we get older, ultimately we become disappointed by the whole thing, right? Children are optimistic, they're happy, perhaps even sort of youth in general can be this way. But Schopenhauer thinks as we age, we come to see more and more clearly life for what it is, really something that's not worth it. It's not what it's made out to be, right? As children, we get, and so adding in a little bit of my own content here, just adding to Schopenhauer, I think if Schopenhauer were alive today, he would probably point to a lot of the things that we do with children and for children, in trying to keep them in some sense in a little sort of optimistic, happy bubble, right? We make up all sorts of stories for them and try to protect them from all sorts of things. So I suppose I'll put in a little warning here if you're watching this around children, or anybody you don't want to hear nasty adult things from, maybe turn it off or something, or turn it down. All the stories we tell children, right? All sorts of fictional creatures, right? Depending on your own, like, I'm not saying this is true for everybody, right? But things like Santa Claus, or the Easter Bunny, or the Tooth Fairy, right? We come up with all sorts of stories that we sort of tell children, try to make the world a more magical place, more interesting, make it seem better as well. We often try to protect them from elements of the world that adults know about, but maybe would rather not, right? Things like war and crime, right? Cursing, and you name it. There are all sorts of things we don't reveal to children immediately. The innocence of childhood, that whole notion that somehow children aren't fully aware of the way things are. This is exactly what Schopenhauer is talking about, right? When we are children, or when we see other children, they're in this situation where everything seems really nice, right? Well, at least hopefully, right? The people around them are really nice. Their experiences are generally nice. They themselves hopefully aren't suffering too much, particularly from illnesses and pains and so on. As we get older, our bodies just cease to function as well as they did, right? You get increasing things like, I don't know, back pain, or your eyesight gets worse, your hearing gets worse, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? All this stuff. So we try to sort of preserve childhood as this time of happiness and innocence and pleasure. And in fact, many older people, right, and I'm older in the sense of not children, right, just sort of adults in general, can look to childhood as the sort of preserve of innocence and happiness, this time before all the troubles and worries and sufferings that come with adulthood are sort of fully realized. We can, in some sense, get lost in that innocence of childhood. This is exactly what Schopenhauer is talking about. So if you take the life of an individual and you really sort of track through it, as a child, it'll be sort of innocent, generally happy, hopefully pleasurable, right? Hopefully, right? But it seems like children have a better chance of having a life like that than adults do, because as we age, we start to suffer more, and we also start to realize more things about the world, which itself adds to our suffering. Okay, so not only is life characterized primarily by suffering, we suffer more as time goes on, but Schopenhauer thinks that really the best we can hope for is freedom from suffering, right? It's really completely vain to hope for a pleasurable, happy life on the whole. Really, the best you can hope for is freedom from suffering. This also comes from his metaphysical thesis that, in fact, happiness, pleasure is really just an absence of pain and suffering. Happiness or pleasure isn't real. It's just not actually experiencing pain and suffering at the time. So the best you can hope for is a kind of break even, right? If you never had pain or suffering, then you would be sort of neutral. It wouldn't really be a positive experience. But even at that, Schopenhauer thinks if you never had pain and suffering in general, you'd wind up having pain and suffering because you'd be bored from the fact that nothing's going on. And so there's just no escaping that you're going to have to experience suffering. It's really a question of how much. So perhaps I should have even reworded the slide. The best we can hope for is freedom from most suffering. That's really the best. As Schopenhauer puts it, again, he's just got so many great one-liners, it's hard not to just quote him all the time. He says, the happiness of any given life is to be measured, not by its joys and pleasures, but by the extent to which it has been free from suffering, from positive evil. Now, as Schopenhauer talks about the lower animals, right? Basically, non-human animals. Of course, he's got that sort of good old-fashioned 19th century. Humans are really the pinnacle of creation. other animals are lower and worse than we are, which is sort of interesting given all the things we're about to hear him say. Perhaps he should have reevaluated whether or not other animals are really lower than humans, but we'll set that aside for now. Schopenhauer thinks that these other sorts of creatures, non-human animals, really have a better existence than we do. Right? They seem to have a happier destiny than us. Right? He says, however varied the forms that human happiness and misery may take, leading a man to seek the one and shun the other, the material basis of it all is bodily pleasure or bodily pain. Right? Ultimately, it is simply food, health, protection from wet and cold, the satisfaction of the sexual instinct, or else the absence of these things that produce pain or pleasure in us. So really, all of our pain and pleasure really come down to bodily experience, he thinks. But there is some room here for our mental and emotional complexity to come into play. And of course, this is really what Schopenhauer thinks separates humans from other animals. And to some extent, that seems correct, right? Humans do seem different from other animals. Interesting question of whether or not that's a difference in kind. We're sort of radically different from them, or if it's just a difference in degree. We are like them. It's just we've got certain capacities and characteristics that are more advanced. We just have more capacity for thought and language and tool making and so on. So I'll just leave that to the side here. But we are different, at least to some degree, to other animals. And this emotional and mental capacity that we often hold up as what makes us higher and better than other sorts of creatures. Schopenhauer actually draws our attention to the fact that these make us more sensitive to every kind of pleasure, but also to every kind of pain. So we have a greater susceptibility to pain and pleasure than other creatures do, Schopenhauer thinks. I think that's something we could quite potentially debate with actual scientific investigations. He himself is basing this on sort of, pseudo-scientific views from early 19th century. But he thinks we are more sensitive to pleasure and pain than other sorts of creatures. But it's not just our susceptibility to it directly, but rather particularly our increased mental capacity lets us anticipate our happy and unhappy states, our pleasures and pains more than other creatures do. So humans, we're conscious of our mortality, right? That's something that can cause us great pain and suffering, just being aware of that fact and thinking about it. But also on a smaller scale, knowing that there's something bad coming for us or knowing that good times are going to end, so we can anticipate pleasurable and painful experiences. When we anticipate pleasurable experiences, Schopenhauer thinks this actually makes those experiences a little worse because we build them up in our head and then they're often not quite as good as we think they are. Here again, we can think about Fisher when he's talking about different sorts of pleasures. And you can think about this if you think about a trip or a holiday or whatever it might be. We sort of build things up in our head and anticipate them, get really excited. And then, not always, but I think certainly at least sometimes, they're not really as good as we made them out to be. And so there's a kind of disappointment that comes in. And so the net result, Schopenhauer thinks, is that our pleasures are actually made less pleasurable by our anticipation of them, because then there's this room for disappointment. And our pains and our suffering is actually even worse, because not only do we experience the pain and the suffering when it's there, but we can anticipate it ahead of time. Right? We know something bad is coming. That itself makes us suffer and gives us a kind of pain. We can then also remember it afterward, which itself prolongs the pain. So one bad experience can be this thing that actually spreads itself out in your own mental experience over time. So the net result is that we suffer more and experience pain less than other animals do. Now, like I was saying before, even if we manage to satisfy our various needs, we get bored, he thinks, unlike other animals. Now here again, there's a very open question. Don't other animals get bored? I think at least some of them do, just based on the observable evidence. But Schopenhauer thinks humans suffer from boredom much more than other animals do. And he says, of a truth, need and boredom are the two poles of human life. Boredom is a form of suffering unknown to brutes, at any rate in their natural state. So animals just left to themselves out in nature, not being domesticated or caged or anything like that, really won't experience boredom because they can, whenever they have some sort of instinct or desire to do something, they're going to go out and do it. They're far too active and wrapped up in things to ultimately get bored. And so really, boredom in animals is something that is a result of human interference, right? Our interfering with animals' ability to exercise their natural capacities and act on their own desires. Now, in addition to the fact that our increased mental and emotional complexity compared to other animals makes us experience pain more painfully and pleasure less pleasurably, Schopenhauer thinks we also produce other artificial needs and desires for ourselves that other animals don't have. So things like desiring luxury goods, particularly our focus and our desire to have other people have a good opinion of us, right? Caring about what people think, right? Questions of honor and shame. Schopenhauer thinks these are sort of peculiarly, it still came out funny, particularly human characteristics, right? We seem to be, Schopenhauer would think, and here again, I think we now have more evidence about how many different sorts of animals are, and I don't think this is quite right, but I think certainly if we think of it sort of as a matter of degree, humans seem the most concerned out of any animal I'm aware of with the opinions of our fellow species, right? We care about what other humans think about us, and in fact, it can be a great source of pleasure. Right? We all like it when people like us and give us, I don't know, thumbs up or happy faces or whatever people do on social media these days. Right? We like the positive feedback, and we feel deeply wounded by the negative feedback, even if we think it's unjustified. So here I'll, just mention, if I have course evaluations or something like that, and somebody criticizes me, even if I think the grounds of the criticism are wrong, it can be hard not to, in some sense, feel a little bit offended if it's clear that somebody doesn't like me. Right? Even if I look at it and I say, those are actually really bad reasons not to like me, or those are unrealistic expectations for what I might do. It can still hurt, right? We often have this kind of self-defense mechanism that when we feel hurt by somebody because we're rejected, we then turn around and reject them, right? So there's this whole cycle of need we have. We need other people to like us. We crave their admiration and so on. Then when they don't give it to us, we feel hurt, and so we reject them, and then likely they feel hurt and reject us, right? We have this whole social sphere that's this whole extra layer of pain and pleasure, but as well as desires for luxury goods and particular things. So it's not enough to have food and shelter and be able to sun ourselves on a nice day and to be free for the most part from pain and suffering, hunger and thirst and things like that, right? Oh no, if we have that, then we're immediately bored, and we're constantly going. We're like this ravenous horde where we need entertainment and attention. We need things to distract us in some sense, because if we're not distracted, we're going to focus on pain and suffering. And even if we don't have pain and suffering to focus on, we're going to get bored. And so just adding one more thing to that Schopenhauer doesn't quite say, but I think fits in rather nicely with what he's saying. Not everyone, but I've certainly noticed that many people really like to fixate on complaining, right? Get together and commiserate, complain about anything, everything, right? Talk about what's wrong, what's bad. That's what we focus on. We just sort of draw our attention there. We don't focus on good things, right? And we can talk about this in lots of ways, whether it's just standing around with a few people to talk about it, or thinking about news and what sorts of news stories get the most attention. So this isn't just sort of some criticism of the media generally, but rather the media is responding to our own inclinations, right? And we are more attracted to, and we give our attention to, bad things. So we get lots of bad news, we complain about lots of stuff, right? Less frequently, at least it's been my experience, just sort of in general with people, people get together and just talk about what's good, right? What's nice, what's lovely, what's pleasurable, what's going well, right? What's not problematic. No, it's typically not what we focus on, right? We focus on what's bad, what's painful, what should be different, right? And if we don't have things like that, we're susceptible to boredom, right? We're these very needy creatures, Schopenhauer thinks. Now, other sorts of creatures, right, such as domestic pets, given an agreeable environment, right, given a situation where they are not, in a sense, forced into boredom because they lack the right kind of environment to keep them stimulated and interested, right? If you give other creatures an agreeable environment, they will suffer less than humans. And in fact, Schopenhauer thinks that our domestic pets are the present moment personified, right? They're untroubled by the past. They don't worry about the past. They don't focus on it. They don't, fixate on what went wrong or how they suffered at some point. And here again, perhaps he's relying on certain outdated notions that somehow pets and other sorts of animals have no memories or something like that, which seems demonstrably false. But there's a real question about exactly what assumptions he's making in the background of these statements. But they aren't thinking about the future, right? They're just living in the here and now. And so if they've got a good here and now, it's a sunny day, they've got food in their belly, they've got a drink of water, they can exercise and explore even just the same neighborhood, right? They can be satisfied, they can be happy, right? Schopenhauer says it is just this characteristic way in which the brute gives himself up entirely to the present moment that contributes so much to the delight we take in our domestic pets. They are the present moment personified, and in some respects they make us feel the value of every hour that is free from trouble and annoyance, which we, with our thoughts and preoccupations, mostly disregard. I think on this note, speaking from experience, Schopenhauer is probably correct. I think this, I'm less certain about, but this is part of what we enjoy about children as well, right? That they are so focused just on the here and now. They aren't, in some sense, stuck in time and sort of spread out, looking to the future, thinking about the past and being distracted from the present. Rather, children, I'm thinking very small children here, and animals can just live right in the moment. They can just take the experience as it is. If it's painful, it's going to be upsetting, and obviously it's painful, but once it's done, right? If it's pleasurable, well, it can be even better. And they can be satisfied with less, right? They aren't like us where we could be sitting out in the sun and it's just lovely, and we're not hungry, we're not thirsty, like there's nothing wrong. And we say, oh, I'm bored, right? I don't have anything to do. Like, oh, right, because we have this sort of artificial need to constantly be doing things and attracted to things. Okay. Now, this is where we come to a couple of slides of material that's not in our reading. So I'm going to mention this, like I said. You can draw on these slides if you want. If you want some more information about this, I can track it down and give it to you, so feel free to contact me. Schopenhauer, in the longer version of this piece, talks about two ways of approaching life, sort of two broad types of ethics. One is the ethics of the Greeks, as he puts it. And he says the object of Greek ethics is to enable a man to lead a happy life. It's really about leading a good life in this world, in the kind of life we can expect a human life to be. Here you can think in some sense of the Rosemont reading on Confucianism. And I think there's some fairly interesting parallels between Confucianism and something like Aristotle's ethics, where Aristotle is, like Confucius, similarly focused on what is it that makes for a good life in the world as we know it, in the kind of society that Aristotle was familiar with. Confucius is giving an account of what would make for a good life in the society he's familiar with. It's really not focused on the beyond. It's not about an afterlife. It's very much relational, right? Who you are depends on your situation, your family, and so on. What obligations you have, what you ought to do, depends on where you're born and your position in society and encounters you have, the situations you find yourself in. And there isn't just some one sort of abstract principle or something we can apply to every situation to figure out what we should do. Rather, there are, ethics is really multifaceted. There's a lot to it. There are right answers to what to do in a given situation, but what that right answer is really depends on a lot of factors. The other ethic that Schopenhauer talks about, and these are his terms, so he talks about the ethics of the Greeks and then the ethics of the Hindus. And he says the object of Hindu ethics is to free and redeem us from life altogether. So the Greeks, in the way Schopenhauer is sort of painting this intellectual picture, and he was familiar with the Greeks. To the best of my knowledge, Schopenhauer wasn't familiar with Chinese philosophy, wasn't familiar with Confucianism, but was familiar with really intellectual traditions coming out of India. So Hinduism, Buddhism. He saw in Hinduism, as well as Buddhism, really this fixation on getting out of life, getting away from it. So whereas the Greeks were focused on trying to find a happy, fulfilling life in this world, in our human life here, as Schopenhauer sees it, really the Hindus are looking at trying to get out of it altogether, right? Rather than focusing on how to live well here and now. It's really about how to get away from the whole thing. Now, of course, there's some big questions about whether or not he's right. And I think making these sorts of very broad generalizations, oh, the Greeks had this kind of idea and the Hindus had that kind of idea, that's probably a little too hasty as a way of summing things up. But there might be a kernel of truth in this for either the groups he's talking about. I'm just going to leave that aside as well. I'm not really going to remark on, particularly on that second point, if he's accurate there. But I think he is tapping into something that there's at least some thread of. Right? It's not like he's totally making it up, but he might be committing a hasty generalization, going from some small strand of thinking or writing that he's familiar with to generalizing for everything. Now, he takes this and, in fact, looks over to Christianity, and he talks a little bit about Judaism as well. And he says that he can see these same two attitudes, these same two sort of ancient attitudes of the Greeks and the Hindus being embodied in the Old and New Testaments. The Old Testament is really one that looks at sort of how to live in this world. It's so in the story of in the Old Testament, you get the story of the fall, and Schopenhauer says this is really the only thing in there that I think is akin to my thinking that I can really agree with. And that story of the fall, what's really the lesson in there? The world's a kind of mistake. It's the product of sin, right? It's an accident, or it's a violation of the law. It's not the way things were supposed to be, right? Schopenhauer says, I think that's right. I think that's what the Old Testament gets right. But the rest of it, which, as he puts it in the reading, he says, the Old Testament represents man as under the dominion of law, in which, however, there is no redemption. And so here again, you could think a little bit about Fackenheim and thinking about Judaism. And this is really what Schopenhauer has in mind, that God gives man a kind of covenant, says, okay, so here's the divine law, here are the things I want you to do and the things I don't want you to do. Fackenheim says, and really on a Jewish view, we find the meaning of life and really the purpose of existence precisely in that covenantal relationship with God, right? That's just what we are, right? We are creations of God, that God wants to live in a certain kind of way. There's really just nothing higher or better than that, right? Even if we fail, we attempt to try to live up to what God wants us to be. That's really what it's all about. But Schopenhauer really disagrees with that. He says, there's just no way to do it. We can't live up to that standard. And so it's the New Testament that Schopenhauer thinks is really in line with the ethic of the Hindus and with his own philosophy. And it's in the New Testament, he says, the New Testament declares law to have failed. It frees man from its dominion, and in its stead preaches the kingdom of grace to be won by faith, love of neighbor, and the entire sacrifice of self. He even points out to some Christian church fathers as taking this view. He says, true Christianity regards our existence as the consequence of sin and error. The result of all of this, Schopenhauer thinks, is that really the lesson of the New Testament, the lesson of the Hindus, and in fact, Schopenhauer's own lesson, really what he wants to teach everybody, which he thinks is something that is being largely forgotten or misunderstood in Christianity as he sees it, within the 19th century. Really, what's the result of all this, right? We must turn our back upon the world and deny the will to live, right? That's really our redemption. That's how we can lead the best sort of life, by, in some sense, giving up on life itself. Now, just a few words on it. We talk about the will to live there. And so thinking about the Schopenhauer's broader philosophy, Schopenhauer was, in some sense, one of the first people, or at least somebody who's very influential on this, in drawing attention to desire and will. So if you look through really history of ideas and history of philosophy in 17th, 18th centuries, what you get is a big focus on reason and reasoning, right? How we think, how we use logic and work our way through different ideas like that. When it comes to willing, really acts of will and desires and choices seem largely, though not exclusively, so this again is sort of a generalization, to be secondary to our rational thinking. So it's really our reasoning that somehow guides our desires and our choices. And so the desires and choices are, in some sense, all secondary. And Schopenhauer flips that around and says, no, the primacy is really on the desires, right? It's really on the passions. Here again, it's not like nobody before Schopenhauer said this, but Schopenhauer thinks that, in fact, the desires and the will to live is really sort of the ultimate one, or the package of desires, has utter primacy, and that reasoning is completely secondary. Reasoning can be used as a kind of tool by these things, but it's even a mistake to think that all of our desires and our willing admits of reasoning. So when it comes to the will to live, really what Schopenhauer is drawing attention to is just the desire that living creatures have to stay alive, right? And he just says, look around, look at the entire world of living things, right? Humans included. We just have this drive to stay alive. And if you ask, say people, right, why do you want to live? You're actually not going to get very good answers, particularly in light of the fact, Schopenhauer would say, that our life is really just all suffering, right? Wouldn't it make sense if we were really fully reasonable creatures that we would all just end our existence, right? We'd all just kill ourselves and get it over with, right? In some sense, he'd say, well, yeah, but we don't, which is precisely what shows us that it's not reason that's really in charge of things. It's this will to live, this instinctual reaction we have to danger, that we just want to stay alive, right? Why? That's all downstream. We could come up with reasons, right? Perhaps, but we don't fundamentally govern ourselves through the use of reason. That's not really what's at bottom. So it's really this will to live, this sort of striving, this desiring. Schopenhauer thinks that's really, in some sense, that's the essence of the world. So that big book of his, The World as Will and Representation, in Schopenhauer's view, what's the true nature of reality? Well, much like certain philosophies and religions, Schopenhauer thinks the world as we see it is really a kind of illusion or a fiction or a dream of some sort. It's not fully real. It is real insofar as it's really a kind of idea or almost dream. It's real in some sense, but ultimately reality is all one, and it's one giant will. It's one desire. So you could think of it in terms of a god or something like that, but Schopenhauer really pulls back from that, because that again suggests reasoning and morality and all of these other sorts of things. But he himself thinks really at bottom, reality is just desiring, it's striving, it's perpetually trying to achieve some kind of goal. And when we think about it in terms of what he's already been saying here, when we haven't achieved our goal, we're striving towards it, we're pained and we suffer because we don't have what we want. And then once we achieve the goal, we're sort of satisfied, and we lose that desire for a time. But then boredom sets in, and then the desiring kicks back in, and we're, in a sense, off to the races again, desiring and working and toiling and troubling and struggling, trying to do things, right? Because we can never just be satisfied or just happy. It only lasts for a short amount of time, and we're right back to trying to do something else. So we're just trapped in this sort of hamster wheel of existence and doomed to suffer. So really the best thing that we can do, the way of redemption, is really rejecting the will to live. It's, in a sense, denying life, trying to escape from the world, right? The way the ethic of the Hindus advocates, and Schopenhauer says, the way the New Testament tells us too. He says, the doctrine of the New Testament is asceticism. Reject the world, right? It's all about something else. This place isn't worth it. So Schopenhauer thinks, ultimately, his view really provides a kind of justification of why the world is the way it is. Right? He says, think of the world more like a penal colony than anything else, and it'll make sense. Our existence is a kind of mistake. It's an accident, right? Whether or not it's intentional or unintentional, in some sense, it's completely beside the point. Reality as we know it is this kind of mistake, and we're all stuck here together, right? We have to pay the penalty of existence, as he puts it. But what sort of practically does he think this results in? Perhaps surprisingly, he thinks it really results in a call to altruism and being decent people. So there's something similar to, in Schopenhauer's view here, to Buddhism and Christianity, threads in Hinduism, Judaism, all sorts of other religions and philosophies, where Schopenhauer thinks really, what we need to do is realize that this world is a bad place and we're all stuck here together, and indulge each other, be kind to each other, help each other, realize that we're all stuck here suffering together, and realize that really all the problems that humans have in general are problems that we all have, right? Our fixation on suffering, our inability to be happy, and so on. And so really what we ought to try to do is to help each other suffer as little as possible, while realizing that being stuck in this world, stuck in this kind of penal colony, there is just no way of being free from suffering entirely. Now, Schopenhauer doesn't sort of fully discuss what it is to live for a meaningful life here, but he certainly doesn't think there's any kind of real immortality, personal immortality, or anything like that, or that there's anything better waiting for us sort of after we've ended our lives. So really our existence is this kind of time during which we're here and suffer to a more or less degree, but suffer nevertheless. And that really death is an escape from suffering only in the sense that it's then just kind of nothing. But we are all manifestations of this underlying will to live. So like Buddhism, Schopenhauer thinks life is really overall characterized by suffering. But unlike Buddhism, Schopenhauer really doesn't give us any kind of pathway of escaping it. There's no nirvana, there's no getting out of it, there's no making things better. There's no sticking a happy face on it and saying, well, I know there's a lot of suffering, but don't worry, it'll all be okay in the end. No, it's all suffering. The end. We can try to make it as little as possible, but really the only way to get out of it is to have our lives end. So he closes with this, and so I figured it's a good spot to close on as well, that once we realize these truths, we recognize things the way they are, and we come to regard each other the right way. He says, really our proper greeting to one another should be my fellow sufferer. He says, this may perhaps sound strange, but it is in keeping with the facts. It puts others in a right light, and it reminds us of that which is, after all, the most necessary thing in life, the tolerance, patience, regard, and love of neighbor, of which everyone stands in need, and which, therefore, every man owes to his fellow. So we'll go ahead and stop here. I hope this has helped make some sense of Schopenhauer's view, whether or not you liked it. And next week, I'll be back with further lectures including, as I said, one on Edwards, where he specifically takes Schopenhauer, as well as at least one other person in our reading, to task for what he sees as having too high of a standard for what would really make for a good life, and for mischaracterizing the facts. But that'll have to wait for next week. And until then, I hope you're doing well. I hope you have a wonderful end of your week and a wonderful weekend. And I'll see you on Monday. Bye for now.